What are we talking about when we talk about God? In one sense, you see, it's just a very small, simple word. It only takes up 3 letters. It doesn't look like very much. But on the other hand, of course, this word God is the one which has occupied the thoughts of philosophers and artists and believers and doubters down over so many years. When we talk about God, we sense that we're talking about something which must be rather important, but can we actually agree on what we mean by the word when we use it? And if we can't agree on that, is there any point in using the word at all? To say I believe in God or I don't believe in God becomes completely meaningful if we don't know what we mean by God. The philosopher Wittgenstein said, "What we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence." And there's a great sense of reverence in that. And if God is beyond our understanding, is there a sense in which perhaps we shouldn't be speaking about God at all, but rather pass over the subject in silence? That may sound strange given our religious traditions, which are all about speaking about God, our church, which is all about speaking about God. But it's perhaps not so strange. You know, in much of the writing, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, God is not given a name. He's given a set of letters, YHW, so YHVH actually it is, designed to be unsayable, a word with no vowels in it, so that people cannot talk about God, because there was this sense that God is so holy that any talk about him is going to be inappropriate, irreverent. When we think of how Jesus addressed God, perhaps most famously in the prayer which we use each week at church, he calls God our Father, which sounds like a name, but actually it's not a name, is it? It's a description. And immediately he follows that by saying, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." The sense that God's name, whatever it might be, is too hallowed, too holy for us to use. And if we look through the Gospels, the Gospel of John in particular, there is this repeated sense that whenever we think of God, we're thinking of one altogether too mysterious for our knowledge. This God who lives in light, inaccessible, hidden from our eyes. That sense of God being too mysterious, too holy for us to talk about, has always had a place in the history of the church. Meister Eckhart, the great mystic, once famously prayed, "God, rid me of God." He wasn't praying that he might somehow become a non-believer, an atheist, but he was recognizing that the God he has in his mind is a construct of his own thinking, his own imagination, and he knows that the real God must be beyond the powers of his thinking and his imagination. So he prays that God would remove these sort of mental idols from his thinking so that he might be free to discover the real God who lies behind that. More recently, the philosopher Paul Tillich wrote about the God who is beyond God. Again, that recognition that whatever we think we're talking about when we say God, the real thing must be beyond whatever we can think and imagine. So what am I saying? Am I saying that we shouldn't talk about God, that any talk we have is just inevitably nonsense? I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think that as long as we recognise that our truth about God is not the truth about God, as long as we have some humility and some reality in our thinking about the limits of our knowledge, then talking about God becomes a very worthwhile thing to do, which is just as well for me, or I wouldn't be in a job for very long. How can we talk about God? Meister Eckhart again gives an image of God as one who hides himself from us, but then who coughs just to let us know that he's there. And the Christian belief is that while God is beyond our human understanding, nonetheless God chooses to reveal at least parts of himself to us. That's what we think the Bible is all about, giving us an insight into God. Perhaps we should say not an insight, but actually a whole massive collection of insights, which are often quite contradictory. So he's described as a God of peace, but he leads his people into war. He's a God who knows everything, but who asks questions. He's a God who has names, but who is beyond every name. And the interesting thing is that the writers of the Bible felt no need, as modern thinkers might, to somehow resolve all of these contradictions, because they understand they could never hope to capture a simple definition of God. Perhaps it's like looking into the sun. You think if you stare closely enough, you'll be able to see more, but of course the effect is just to blind us, so much light pouring in our direction. Perhaps that's why Christians have always claimed that the best image of God we have is the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus, who doesn't give much factual information about God, but who lives a life through which we see the priorities and the character of God. A life which is all about love and compassion and healing and sacrifice. A life which shows a force of life which is greater even than death. Pete Rollins compares us to being infants held in the arms of the mother. So we might look into the face of the mother and wonder about her and wonder where she comes from and what she does and try to understand. But of course the infant can never hope to understand much about the mother. Any knowledge we might think we have will actually be completely irrelevant. What matters is that the child knows that when it looks into the face of the mother, that it's cared for, that it's loved, that it's nurtured, that it's protected. And perhaps that's the best knowledge we can have of God. It's interesting, the Bible actually uses the word knowledge in that sense. You know, when we talk about the sex act, we might say he knew her in the biblical sense. Adam knew Eve and she conceived. And that's quite a profound meaning. It tells us that in the Hebrew way of thinking, to know someone is not to know facts about the person, but to have that very intimate, personal, close connection. A connection that goes beyond thoughts, beyond words. So what are we talking about when we talk about God? Well, perhaps that's what we're talking about, something which goes beyond words. And it's interesting to talk about something that goes beyond words. It's a huge challenge, but perhaps it is one of the most important things we have to talk about.